The oak tree stood like a cathedral in the Texas heat, its ancient branches spreading wide enough to shelter 20 souls from the relentless sun that baked the dusty ground outside Murphy's in the summer of 1873. And beneath its cooling shade sat a woman whose voice could make even the wildest ranch child sit still and listen to stories of faraway places they had never seen. Sarah Northfield had arrived in Murphy's 6 months earlier with nothing but 2 trunks of books, a teaching certificate from a Philadelphia normal school, and a heart full of determination that had not yet been tested by the reality of frontier life. The town had no schoolhouse, no budget for education, and barely enough civilized structure to call itself a proper settlement, but it had children who deserved to learn their letters and numbers, and Sarah had decided that was enough reason to stay. The oak tree had become her classroom by necessity, rather than choice. The first day she had attempted to teach, she had gathered the 7 children whose parents had agreed to send them in the town's only church. But the preacher had made it clear that his building was for Sunday worship and Wednesday prayer meetings, not for filling young heads with arithmetic and geography on weekday mornings. So Sarah had looked around the sparse landscape of Murphy's, spotted the magnificent oak at the edge of town near the creek, and decided that nature would provide what civilization could not. Now, as August settled over the Texas plains like a heavy blanket, Sarah had 15 students ranging from 5-year-old Emma Patterson to 13-year-old James Cordell. They sat on logs and stumps that Sarah had arranged in a semicircle, each child clutching a slate and chalk that Sarah had purchased with her own meager funds. She stood before them in a simple cotton dress that had once been blue but had faded to the color of distant sky, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, her green eyes bright with the passion that made even the reluctant learners pay attention. "Who can tell me what grows in the soil of Illinois?" Sarah asked, pointing to a hand-drawn map she had tacked to the oak's trunk. "Corn, Miss Northfield," called out 10-year-old Margaret Simmons, her hand shooting up with enthusiasm. "Excellent, Margaret. And why does corn grow so well there?" As the children debated soil composition and rainfall patterns, a rider approached on a dappled gray horse, moving at an easy pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry. Thomas Nash had been watching the Oak Tree School for 3 days now, though he had been careful not to let the teacher notice his observation. He was a man who believed in understanding a situation before inserting himself into it, a habit that had served him well in his 26 years of life, particularly during the years he had spent working cattle drives from South Texas all the way to Kansas. Thomas was not originally from Murphy's. He had drifted into town 2 weeks ago with money in his pocket from a successful drive and a weariness in his bones that told him it might be time to stop drifting and start building something permanent. He had seen enough of the frontier to know what mattered and what was just noise. A good woman teaching children under a tree despite having no proper building, no support from the town council, and likely no decent pay. That mattered. He dismounted about 50 yards from the oak tree, not wanting to disrupt the lesson, and began to walk the perimeter of what he had already decided would be the foundation of a schoolhouse. Thomas had worked construction in San Antonio one winter when trail work was scarce, and he had learned enough about building to know what was possible. The spot was good, level ground with decent drainage, close enough to town for easy access, but far enough from the saloons and gambling houses to provide a proper learning environment. Sarah noticed him on her second glance away from her students. She had learned to be aware of her surroundings in Murphy's, a town where men outnumbered women 10 to 1, and where a single woman was viewed as either a curiosity or an opportunity depending on the character of the observer. But this man seemed different. He was not watching her with the calculating eyes of the cowboys who sometimes loitered outside the general store. He was walking slowly around the open space near the oak tree, occasionally crouching down to examine the ground, standing up to sight along invisible lines. When the lesson concluded, and the children scattered toward their various homes, Sarah began collecting the slates and arranging her books in the wooden crate that served as her mobile library. She was aware that the stranger was approaching, and she straightened her spine in preparation for whatever conversation was about to occur. "Miss Northfield." Thomas removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that was slightly too long and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His eyes were a striking blue, the kind that seemed even brighter against his tanned face. "Yes." Sarah's voice was cautious but not unfriendly. "My name is Thomas Nash. I am new to Murphy's and I have been watching your school." Sarah's expression cooled slightly. "If you have concerns about my teaching methods, you are welcome to speak with the parents of my students." Thomas shook his head quickly. "No, madam, nothing like that. I have been watching because I think what you are doing here is admirable, and I think you deserve better than teaching under a tree. While I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Nash, I teach under this tree because it is the only option available to me. The town has made it clear that education is not a priority worth funding." "What if someone built you a proper schoolhouse?" Thomas asked, his directness catching Sarah off guard. "Nothing fancy, but solid walls, a good roof, windows for light, a stove for winter, desks for the children." Sarah stared at him, trying to determine if he was serious or simply making conversation. "That would require significant resources and labor. The town council has already refused my requests 3 times. "I am not talking about the town council," Thomas said. "I am talking about me building it." "Why would you do such a thing?" Thomas considered the question carefully. He could have given her a simple answer about civic duty or community improvement, but something about the way she stood there, books clutched against her chest like precious cargo, deserved honesty. "Because I have spent the last 8 years of my life moving cattle from one place to another, earning money and spending it, never building anything that lasted longer than a campfire. I have been looking for something worth doing, and this seems like it might be that thing." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of ulterior motives or false charity. She had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too generous, especially from men she did not know. But Thomas Nash's expression was earnest, almost hopeful, like a man presenting an idea he genuinely believed in. "I have no money to pay you," Sarah said finally. "I am not asking for payment." "Then what are you asking for?" Thomas smiled slightly. "Permission to build on this land, I suppose, and maybe the chance to prove that not every cowboy who rides into Murphy's is looking for whiskey and card games." Despite herself, Sarah felt a small smile tug at her lips. "The land belongs to Samuel Garrett. He owns most of the property around here. You would need his permission." "I will get it," Thomas said with quiet confidence. "Is that a yes from you?" Sarah looked at the oak tree, at the logs and stumps where her students sat, at the crate of books that she carried back and forth from her boarding house each day. She thought about winter coming, about trying to teach in the cold and rain, about the way some parents had already begun to hint that perhaps education was not practical, when survival required all hands working. "If you can truly build a schoolhouse, Mr. Nash, then yes, you have my permission and my gratitude." Thomas settled his hat back on his head and nodded. "I will start tomorrow." He kept his word. By noon the following day, Thomas had secured permission from Samuel Garrett, who owned the land and who seemed bemused, but agreeable to the idea of a school being built on his property. By evening, Thomas had visited the lumber mill and the hardware store, pricing materials and making calculations in a small leather notebook he carried in his vest pocket. Sarah watched the preparations with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had learned not to count on promises in Murphy's, where intentions often withered in the harsh reality of frontier life. But Thomas Nash moved with the purposeful efficiency of a man who had made up his mind and would not be easily deterred. On the third day, Thomas began digging the foundation posts. Sarah's students gathered around during their lunch break, fascinated by the sight of the tall cowboy working with post-hole diggers, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms, sweat darkening his collar despite the morning hour. "Is he really building us a school, Miss Northfield?" asked Emma Patterson, her small voice filled with wonder. "It appears so," Sarah replied, still not quite believing it herself. Thomas looked up from his work and waved at the children, who waved back enthusiastically. Sarah noticed that his smile was genuine, not the perfunctory expression adults often gave children, but real warmth that suggested he actually enjoyed their presence. Over the following weeks, Sarah found her attention divided between her teaching duties and the steady progress of the schoolhouse. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, occasionally hiring help from some of the ranch hands who had spare time, but mostly laboring alone. The foundation posts went in first, then the floor joists, then the plank flooring that Thomas sanded smooth so no child would get splinters. Sarah brought him water during the midday heat, a gesture that began as simple courtesy, but gradually became a daily ritual they both anticipated. Their conversation started with practical matters about the building, dimensions of the room and placement of windows, but slowly expanded into more personal territory. "Where did you learn construction?" Sarah asked one afternoon, watching him measure boards with careful precision. "San Antonio, winter of '69. The trail boss I had been working for died of pneumonia, and the drive fell apart. I needed money, and a man named Carlos Mendoza needed workers for a hotel he was building. He taught me that if you are going to do something, you should do it right the first time because you might not get a chance to fix your mistakes. Wise advice." "Carlos was a wise man," Thomas said, marking a board for cutting. "He also taught me that buildings should be beautiful as well as functional, not fancy, necessarily, but pleasing to look at." Sarah glanced at the schoolhouse taking shape and realized he was right. Thomas was building with care and attention to proportion that went beyond mere functionality. The windows were evenly spaced, the roofline would be straight and true, the door would be centered perfectly. "Why did you leave Philadelphia?" Thomas asked, surprising Sarah with the question. She had mentioned her hometown only once in passing. "I wanted to make a difference," Sarah said after a moment. "Back east, there are plenty of teachers, plenty of schools. Out here, there are children who might never learn to read if someone does not teach them. It seemed like the place I was most needed." "Do you miss it, Philadelphia?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "I miss my sister and my mother. I miss concerts and libraries and shops with actual inventory. But I do not miss the suffocation of everyone knowing your business, or the constant pressure to marry well and settle into a life of social calls and needlepoint. Here I can be useful in ways that matter." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand that. The usefulness, I mean." As August turned to September, the schoolhouse walls rose steadily. Thomas framed the structure with careful attention to squareness and level, then began applying the exterior boards. He had chosen good lumber, clear pine that would weather well, and he fitted each board tightly against the next to prevent drafts in winter. Sarah's students were not the only ones watching the construction with interest. The town of Murphys had begun to take notice of the strange project unfolding at the edge of settlement. Some residents approved, viewing it as a sign of civilized progress. Others grumbled about wasted effort and resources on book learning when practical skills were what frontier children really needed. One Saturday afternoon, as Thomas worked on installing the window frames, a delegation from the town council appeared. 3 men, led by Herbert Simmons, who owned the largest general store in Murphys and fancied himself a community leader. "Nash," Simmons called out, his tone carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. "We need to talk about this building you are putting up." Thomas climbed down from his ladder and wiped his hands on his work pants. "What about it?" "Well, for one thing, you did not seek approval from the town council. Did not know I needed approval to build on private land with the owner's permission." Simmons frowned. "It sets a precedent. If everyone just started building whatever they wanted without proper authorization, we would have chaos." "It is a schoolhouse, not a brothel," Thomas said mildly. "I would think the town council would support education." "We have discussed educational facilities in the past," interjected Walter Morrison, who ran the town's small bank. "The consensus was that Murphys is not yet large enough to justify the expense." "Good thing I am not asking for town money then," Thomas replied. The third councilman, a rancher named Patrick Doyle, spoke up with a more conciliatory tone. "Look, Nash, nobody is saying education is bad, but Miss Northfield has been managing fine under the oak tree. Why go to all this trouble?" "Because managing is not the same as thriving," Thomas said. "And because children deserve better than sitting on logs in the heat and rain. If you gentlemen want to help with the construction, you are welcome. If you want to donate desks or books, I am sure Miss Northfield would be grateful. But if you are just here to complain about progress, then I have work to do." Simmons's face reddened. "You are an outsider, Nash. You have been in Murphys for what, a month? You do not get to decide what this town needs." "Neither do you," Sarah's voice cut through the tension. She had been working with a student under the oak tree and had approached when she noticed the confrontation. "This schoolhouse is being built on private property, funded by private money, and will serve a public good. Your approval, while it would be nice, is not required." Simmons turned to face her. "Miss Northfield, you have been a guest in this town for half a year. Perhaps you should be more mindful of how you speak to established residents." "I am mindful of children who deserve an education," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the anger Simmons's tone provoked. "I am mindful of parents who want their sons and daughters to have opportunities beyond what they had. And I am mindful of the fact that this town will either grow into a real community or remain a collection of buildings where people temporarily sleep between working and drinking." Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. "Now, Miss Northfield, there is no need for such harsh characterizations." "Is there not?" Sarah gestured toward the schoolhouse. "Mr. Nash has been here less than a month, as Mr. Simmons pointed out, and he has already contributed more to the educational future of Murphys than the town council has in years of meetings. Perhaps instead of questioning his motives, you should be thanking him." Doyle, who had been silent during most of the exchange, finally spoke with a hint of amusement in his voice. "She has a point, Herbert. My daughter has learned more sitting under that oak tree than I learned in 3 years of occasional schooling back in Missouri. If Nash wants to build a proper schoolhouse on his own dime, I say let him." Simmons looked like he wanted to argue further, but the fight had gone out of his position. "Fine. But when winter comes and you need firewood or when the roof needs repairs, do not come asking the town for assistance." "Would not dream of it," Thomas said evenly. The councilmen departed, Simmons still radiating disapproval while Doyle offered a friendly nod. When they were out of earshot, Thomas turned to Sarah with a rueful expression. "I may have just made your life more difficult with the town leadership." Sarah shook her head. "My life was already difficult with them. At least now we are being difficult in the service of something worthwhile." She paused, then added more softly, "Thank you for standing your ground." "Thank you for defending the project," Thomas replied. "Though I have to say that was quite a speech about Murphy's being a collection of buildings where people temporarily sleep." "Did you mean that?" Sarah sighed. "Sometimes it feels that way. Most people here are transients, cowboys passing through, prospectors hoping to strike it lucky, merchants who will move on to the next boomtown. Very few seem interested in putting down real roots." "Is that what you want to do? Put down roots here?" "I want to make this place better than I found it," Sarah said. "Whether that means permanent roots or not, I have not decided." As September progressed, the schoolhouse took on its final form. Thomas installed the roof, using good cedar shingles that would shed rain effectively. He built a small covered porch at the entrance, a detail Sarah had not expected but which delighted her when she saw it. Inside, he constructed a simple platform at one end where Sarah could stand while teaching, and he framed in a corner where a stove could be installed before winter. The windows were Thomas's pride, 4 large openings that would flood the room with natural light. He had ordered real glass panes from San Antonio, a significant expense that he had not mentioned to Sarah until they arrived. When she protested the cost, he simply said, "Children should not have to learn in the dark." Sarah found herself thinking about Thomas Nash at odd hours. When she woke in her small room at the boarding house, she wondered if he was already at the construction site. During lessons, she caught herself glancing over to watch him work, admiring the economical grace of his movements. In the evenings, she lay awake remembering conversations they had shared, the way his laugh sounded, the intensity in his blue eyes when he talked about things that mattered to him. It was attraction, she recognized, but also something deeper and more complicated. Thomas represented possibility in a way that both excited and frightened her. Sarah had come west to escape the conventional expectations of Eastern society, to carve out a life on her own terms. Falling for a cowboy, even one who built schoolhouses, had not been part of her plan. For his part, Thomas was equally preoccupied with thoughts of Sarah. He had known many women in his travels, had even fancied himself in love a time or two, but Sarah Northfield was different. She had courage that went beyond the physical bravery required to survive the frontier. She had the moral courage to stand up for what she believed in, to teach children despite having no support, to defend her principles against town councilmen who were used to getting their way. He found himself building the schoolhouse with extra care, adding small touches he knew she would appreciate. A shelf along one wall for her books, a cabinet with a door that closed where she could store supplies safely, a hook by the door for her bonnet and shawl. Each addition was a form of conversation, a way of saying things he was not quite ready to speak aloud. On the first day of October, Thomas installed the final piece of the schoolhouse, a brass bell mounted above the porch. It was another expense Sarah had not expected, and when Thomas rang it for the first time, the clear tone carried across Murphy's like a declaration of purpose. "There," Thomas said with satisfaction. "Now you have a proper school bell to call your students." Sarah stood on the porch, looking at the building that had risen from nothing but determination and lumber. The walls were solid, the roof was tight, the windows gleamed in the afternoon sun. Inside, the space was clean and bright, smelling of fresh wood and possibility. "I do not know how to thank you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You do not need to thank me," Thomas replied. Seeing it finished is thanks enough." "That is not true," Sarah said, turning to face him. "You have spent weeks of labor and considerable money on this project. You have dealt with difficult town politics and summer heat and a dozen other obstacles. The least you deserve is proper acknowledgement of what you have accomplished." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his pulse beat in his throat. "What I would like," he said carefully, "is permission to call on you properly. Not as a builder talking to a teacher about construction details, but as a man interested in getting to know a woman better." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "Mr. Nash, Thomas," he interrupted gently, "I think we are past formalities." "Thomas," Sarah corrected, tasting his name on her lips. "I came to Murphy's to build a life independent of romantic entanglements. I wanted to prove that a woman could make her own way without needing to attach herself to a man." "I understand that," Thomas said. "And I am not asking you to attach yourself to anyone. I am just asking if you might want company sometimes, conversation, the chance to see where friendship might lead." Sarah looked at the schoolhouse, at the physical manifestation of Thomas's character and values. A man who would build this, who would invest so much in children he did not know and a community that had not always welcomed him, was a man worth knowing better. "Yes," she said simply, "I would like that." Thomas's smile was worth every moment of uncertainty Sarah had felt. "Then maybe you would let me take you to dinner tomorrow evening. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house serves meals to non-residents on Sunday nights, and her cooking is the best in town." "I know," Sarah said with a laugh. "I live there, remember." "Then you can guarantee I will show up at the right place," Thomas replied, his own laughter mixing with hers. The following day was Sunday, and Sarah attended the morning church service with more attention to her appearance than usual. She wore her best dress, a deep green cotton that matched her eyes, and she took extra time with her hair, arranging it in a softer style than her usual practical bun. Thomas was also at the service, sitting near the back in clean clothes, his hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved. When their eyes met across the congregation, Sarah felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the hymn they were singing. After the service, several townspeople approached Sarah to discuss the schoolhouse. Most were complimentary, eager to see the interior and make plans for the official opening. A few were coolly polite, making it clear they sided with the town council's disapproval. Sarah handled both groups with the diplomatic grace she had learned in Philadelphia drawing rooms, though her patience was tested by some of the more condescending comments. "You really think you can teach properly without formal desks?" asked Martha Simmons, Herbert's wife, her tone dripping with false concern. "I have been teaching for 6 months without formal desks," Sarah replied evenly. "Having walls and a roof will be a significant improvement regardless of the furniture situation. Still, it seems a shame to go to all the trouble of building and then not furnish it properly. If you are offering to donate desks, Mrs. Simmons, I would be happy to accept," Sarah said sweetly. Martha Simmons sniffed and moved away, clearly not having expected her criticism to result in a request for contribution. Thomas appeared at Sarah's elbow, amusement dancing in his eyes. "You handled that well." "Philadelphia society training," Sarah murmured. "We were taught how to deflect criticism while maintaining social graces." "Remind me never to get on your bad side," Thomas said. That evening, they sat together in the dining room of Mrs. Chen's boarding house, eating roasted chicken and vegetables while conversation flowed easily between them. Thomas told stories of cattle drives and trail life, painting pictures of vast prairies and river crossings, of thunderstorms and stampedes, of the peculiar characters who populated the cowboy world. Sarah shared memories of Philadelphia, of her education at the normal school, of her family and the social expectations she had fled. "My mother could not understand why I wanted to come west," Sarah explained, pushing potatoes around her plate. "She thought I was throwing away my future. Her greatest fear was that I would end up a spinster schoolteacher in some dusty frontier town." "And here you are," Thomas said, "a schoolteacher in a dusty frontier town." "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but not because I had no other options, because I chose this." "That is the difference my mother could never grasp. Choice." "I understand choice," Thomas said. "I have been making choices about my direction for years now. Most of them involved avoiding commitment, avoiding putting down roots. This is the first time I have chosen to build something permanent, and it feels right in a way nothing else has." "What changed?" Sarah asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Watching you teach, I think. Seeing someone so committed to making a difference despite having every reason to give up. It made me wonder what I was doing with my life, drifting from job to job without purpose, beyond the next paycheck. I wanted to be part of something that mattered." "The schoolhouse matters," Sarah said softly. "You have given those children something precious." "We have given them something," Thomas corrected. "The building is just wood and nails without you there to fill it with learning." They talked until the dining room emptied and Mrs. Chen began giving them pointed looks about cleaning up for the night. Thomas walked Sarah to her room, both of them moving slowly, reluctant to end the evening. At her door, Thomas took Sarah's hand gently. "Thank you for dinner and conversation." "Thank you for building something beautiful," Sarah replied. Thomas lifted her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that Sarah felt herself blush. Then he released her hand, wished her good night, and headed down the hall to the stairs. Sarah entered her room in a daze of happiness and confusion. She was falling in love with Thomas Nash, she realized, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified her. The school officially opened on Monday morning with 15 students and a handful of parents who came to see the new building. Sarah rang the brass bell at 8 o'clock sharp, and the children filed into the schoolhouse with expressions of wonder. "It is so big, Miss Northfield," Emma Patterson whispered, staring at the high ceiling and the large windows. "It is a proper school," Sarah agreed, her own voice thick with emotion as she looked around the space Thomas had created. The first day in the schoolhouse was magical. The children could write on their slates without worrying about rain, could see their books clearly in the abundant natural light, could focus on lessons without the distractions of outdoor teaching. Sarah moved through the day in a state of grateful amazement, hardly believing that this space was real and permanent. Thomas stopped by at lunchtime, ostensibly to check on how the building was functioning but really to see Sarah's reaction. She met him at the door with a smile that made his heart skip. "It is perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect. No problems. Nothing needs adjusting." "Nothing," Sarah confirmed. "You built it exactly right." As October progressed, Thomas began working on other projects in Murphy's. He repaired a barn for Samuel Garrett, built a new front porch for the boarding house, and helped reinforce the bridge across the creek. But his evenings belonged to Sarah. They took walks along the creek, attended social events together, and spent long hours talking about everything and nothing. The town began to accept them as a couple, though opinions varied on whether it was a suitable match. Some thought Sarah was too educated for a cowboy, even one who could build. Others thought Thomas was too much of a drifter to settle down properly. But the majority could see what was obvious to anyone who watched them together. They were falling deeply in love. In early November, As the weather turned cooler and the first hints of winter appeared on the northern horizon, Thomas asked Sarah to accompany him on a Saturday ride to a spot he had discovered in the hills outside town. Sarah agreed, and they set out on horseback in the morning, with a picnic lunch packed in Thomas's saddlebags. The spot was a small clearing overlooking a valley, with a view that stretched for miles across the Texas landscape. The trees were changing color, splashes of gold and red against the green, and the air was crisp with the promise of coming winter. They spread a blanket and ate bread and cheese, drank water from Thomas's canteen, and talked about the future in a way they had been carefully avoiding until now. "I want to stay in Murphy's," Thomas said, watching Sarah's face carefully. "I have been thinking about buying land, maybe starting a horse ranch. Samuel Garrett has property he is willing to sell, good grazing land with water access." "That sounds like a solid plan," Sarah said, her heart beating faster because she suspected where this conversation was heading. "It would be a lot of work," Thomas continued. "Building a house, breaking horses, establishing a reputation as a reliable supplier. Not the kind of work a man should take on alone." Sarah looked at him directly. "What are you asking, Thomas?" He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small diamond that caught the sunlight. "I am asking if you would consider marrying me, Sarah. I know we have not known each other long, and I know you came west to build an independent life, but I love you. I love your courage and your dedication and the way you fight for those children. I want to build a life with you, not trap you in one. I want to support your teaching and watch you change this town for the better. I want to grow old with you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, happy tears that she did not try to hide. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking. "I have been fighting it because I was afraid of losing my independence, but what I have learned is that the right partnership does not diminish you. It enhances who you are." "Is that a yes?" Thomas asked, hope and vulnerability mixing in his expression. "Yes," Sarah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the pent-up longing of the past 2 months. Sarah kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair, her heart soaring with joy. They set a wedding date for January, after the Christmas season, but before the spring planting would require Thomas's full attention on the land he was purchasing. Sarah wrote to her family in Philadelphia, explaining that she was marrying a good man, a cowboy who had built her a schoolhouse and built their love through actions rather than just words. Her mother's response was predictable, concern about Sarah marrying a man she had known for such a short time, worry about life on a frontier ranch. But her sister Martha wrote with genuine happiness, saying that Sarah's letters had been increasingly full of mentions of Thomas Nash, and Martha had suspected a romance was developing even before the engagement announcement. The weeks leading up to the wedding were busy and joyful. Thomas worked on building a house on his new property, a modest but solid structure with 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a front porch that faced the sunrise. Sarah continued teaching, though she and Thomas spent every spare moment together, planning their future and falling more deeply in love. The students at the schoolhouse were excited about Miss Northfield's wedding. The girls wanted to hear every detail about the dress, the ceremony, and the flowers. The boys were more interested in whether Mr. Nash would teach them how to break horses, a possibility that delighted them. On Christmas Eve, the schoolhouse hosted its first community event, a celebration that brought together most of Murphy's for songs and cider. Sarah stood at the front of the room, looking at the faces gathered in the space Thomas had built, and felt overwhelming gratitude for how her life had unfolded. Thomas stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, and when the townspeople sang carols together, their voices rising to the solid roof he had constructed, Sarah knew she had found exactly what she had been seeking when she left Philadelphia. Not escape from a confined life, but the freedom to build something meaningful with someone she loved. The wedding took place on a cold but clear January morning in 1874. Sarah wore a dress of cream-colored silk that her sister had sent from Philadelphia, altered to fit by Mrs. Chen, who turned out to have remarkable sewing skills. Thomas wore a new suit ordered from San Antonio, dark wool that made his blue eyes even more striking. The ceremony was held in the schoolhouse, which seemed fitting given that the building was where their love had been built alongside the walls and windows. The preacher who had refused to let Sarah use the church for teaching had no objections to performing a wedding ceremony, and he spoke about love and commitment and the importance of building lives of purpose. Sarah and Thomas exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises about supporting each other's dreams, about facing frontier challenges together, about building a family and a future in Murphy's. When Thomas kissed his bride, the schoolhouse erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Chen providing a feast that impressed even the most skeptical attendees. Herbert Simmons made a begrudging speech about how the schoolhouse had turned out better than he expected, which was about as close to approval as he was capable of expressing. Patrick Doyle gave a warm toast about how Murphy's was lucky to have both a dedicated teacher and a skilled builder choosing to make the town their permanent home. As evening fell and the celebration wound down, Thomas and Sarah rode out to their new home. The house was finished enough to be livable, though Thomas promised he would continue improving it over the coming months. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace he had built, casting warm light across the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nash," Thomas said, lifting Sarah across the threshold in the traditional gesture. Sarah laughed, her arms around his neck. "It is strange to hear that name." "You will get used to it," Thomas promised, setting her down gently and pulling her close. They stood together in front of the fire, wrapped in each other's arms, discussing the day and their hopes for the future. Thomas talked about the horses he planned to purchase in the spring, about the foals he hoped to raise, about building a reputation as a fair dealer. Sarah talked about expanding the school's curriculum, about teaching older students more advanced subjects, about maybe training other teachers if Murphy's continued to grow. "We should have children," Thomas said suddenly. "I want sons and daughters who will grow up learning to read and write in the schoolhouse I built for their mother." "I want that too," Sarah agreed. "Though perhaps we could wait a bit before starting that particular project. I would like some time to just be us." "However much time you want," Thomas said, kissing her forehead. "We have our whole lives ahead of us." As winter turned to spring, Sarah and Thomas settled into married life. Sarah continued teaching while Thomas worked on establishing his horse ranch. The work was hard but satisfying, each of them pursuing their passions while supporting the other's efforts. In March, 3 families who had been living on the outskirts of the county moved into Murphy's specifically because they had heard about the school. Sarah's student count jumped to 22 children, requiring her to reorganize the classroom and extend teaching hours. Thomas built additional benches and helped her develop a system where older students assisted with teaching younger ones, maximizing Sarah's effectiveness. The town council, seeing the economic benefit of families relocating to Murphy's because of educational opportunities, finally voted to provide a small annual budget for school supplies. Herbert Simmons delivered the news with the grudging air of someone admitting defeat, but Sarah accepted graciously. using the funds to purchase new slates, additional books, and maps that had been beyond her personal budget. By summer, Thomas's horse ranch was established enough to produce its first significant income. He had purchased quality breeding stock and had contracted to provide horses to several ranches in the region. His reputation for honest dealing and well-trained animals spread quickly, and soon he was making regular trips to neighboring towns to deliver horses and negotiate new contracts. Sarah sometimes accompanied him on these trips when school was not in session, and she used the opportunities to purchase books and supplies not available in Murphy's. They became known as a partnership, the teacher and the cowboy who were building something lasting in a region where most people were still just passing through. In the fall of 1874, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas on a cool October evening, almost exactly a year after the schoolhouse had opened. They were sitting on their porch, watching the sun set over the valley, when Sarah took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is a life growing here," she said softly. "Our child." Thomas's face transformed with wonder and joy. He pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her as if she were made of precious glass. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor's confirmation," Sarah replied. "But yes, I am sure." "We need to get you to a doctor," Thomas said immediately. "Make sure everything is progressing well. And we need to think about your teaching schedule, whether you should reduce your hours. And the nursery in the house, we should prepare it." And Sarah laughed and put her hand over his mouth. "Breathe, Thomas. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am strong and healthy, and we have months to prepare." "I just want everything to be perfect," Thomas said. "For you and for our child." "It already is perfect," Sarah assured him. "We have each other, we have a home, we have work that matters. What more could we need?" Sarah continued teaching through the winter, though she did reduce her hours in the final months of her pregnancy. The women of Murphy's, even those who had been skeptical of Sarah initially, rallied around her with advice and support. Mrs. Chen provided special meals to ensure Sarah's nutrition. Martha Simmons, putting aside her earlier coolness, brought by baby clothes her own children had outgrown. Thomas was simultaneously excited and terrified about impending fatherhood. He threw himself into preparing the nursery, building a beautiful cradle from cherry wood and sanding it until the surface was smooth as silk. He read every book about childbirth and infant care that Sarah could find, approaching fatherhood with the same determined competence he brought to building and horse training. In April 1875, Sarah gave birth to a son they named James Thomas Nash. The birth was long and difficult, but Sarah came through it safely, and the baby was healthy and strong. Thomas held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the reality of the tiny life they had created. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, examining the baby's small fingers and toes. "Absolutely perfect." "He has your eyes," Sarah said tiredly but happily from the bed. "And your determination, I suspect," Thomas replied. "Did you hear how loudly he cried when he arrived?" That is the sound of someone who will not be ignored. The months following James's birth were exhausting but wonderful. Sarah took a break from teaching, focusing on her son while Thomas managed both the ranch and many of the household duties. He proved surprisingly adept at cooking and laundry, skills he had learned during his cowboy days and which now served his family well. By fall, Sarah was ready to return to teaching, at least part-time. Mrs. Chen offered to watch James during school hours, a solution that allowed Sarah to continue her educational mission while ensuring her son was well cared for. The arrangement worked beautifully, and Sarah found that she loved the balance of motherhood and teaching, each role enriching the other. The schoolhouse continued to grow. By 1876, Sarah had 35 students, requiring her to hire an assistant teacher. She chose a young woman named Claire Morrison, daughter of the banker, who had been educated back east and had returned to Murphy's with teaching aspirations. Together, Sarah and Claire developed a curriculum that impressed visiting education officials and established Murphy's as a town serious about learning. Thomas's horse ranch also prospered. He expanded his breeding program, added employees to help with the increased workload, and became known throughout the region as one of the most reliable horse suppliers in Texas. The income allowed him and Sarah to make improvements to their home, expand the ranch's facilities, and contribute generously to community projects. In 1877, Sarah gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Catherine Marie. Where James had been a difficult birth, Catherine arrived easily, a placid baby who seemed content with whatever was happening around her. Sarah joked that Catherine had inherited Thomas's calm temperament while James had gotten Sarah's intensity. Life settled into a rhythm of family, work, and community involvement. Thomas served on the town council, where he pushed for infrastructure improvements and fair business practices. Sarah expanded the school's offerings to include evening classes for adults who had never learned to read, a program that proved surprisingly popular among ranch hands and laborers. The schoolhouse that Thomas had built became the center of Murphy's community life. It hosted town meetings, social gatherings, wedding receptions, and holiday celebrations. The oak tree where Sarah had first taught still stood nearby, a reminder of humble beginnings and the determination that had started everything. In 1879, when James was 4 and Catherine was 2, Sarah and Thomas stood together under the oak tree, watching their children play in the grass. The schoolhouse stood solid and strong behind them, its bell gleaming in the afternoon sun. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Giving up the cowboy life. You could have kept drifting, seeing new places, having adventures." Thomas pulled her close, his arm around her waist. "This is my adventure," he said. "Building a life with you, raising our children, watching this town grow. I would not trade it for anything." "Even when James dumps his breakfast on the floor for the third morning in a row?" Sarah asked with a laugh. "Even then," Thomas confirmed. "Though I will admit, I could do without the oatmeal in my boots." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible back in Philadelphia. "I am glad you decided to build that schoolhouse," she said softly. "I am glad you let me," Thomas replied. "Best decision I ever made." They watched as James carefully picked a wildflower and brought it to his little sister, who accepted it with a delighted giggle. Catherine tried to eat the flower, and James gently redirected her, explaining in his serious 4-year-old way that flowers were for looking at, not eating. "He is going to be a good big brother," Sarah observed. "He learned from watching his mother teach," Thomas said. "Patience and kindness." As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold, Thomas and Sarah gathered their children and walked back toward their home. The schoolhouse bell rang once, moved by the evening breeze, a clear note that carried across Murphy's like a blessing. Years passed in the way they do when life is full and purposeful. The school expanded to require 2 full-time teachers plus assistants. The ranch grew to be one of the most successful in the region. James and Catherine were joined by 2 more children, twin boys born in 1882, and named Samuel and David. The children grew up bilingual in books and horses, equally comfortable in the schoolhouse and in the stables. James showed an early aptitude for teaching and would eventually take over the school from his mother. Catherine proved to have her father's gift with horses and would become the ranch's head trainer. Samuel developed a passion for building and would expand the family property with structures as solid and beautiful as his father's schoolhouse. David became a veterinarian, the first in the region, serving the ranching community with skill and compassion. But those accomplishments were still in the future on a summer evening in 1885, when Thomas and Sarah celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a party at the schoolhouse. The building that had started their love story now sheltered their extended family and friends, the community they had helped build through determination and dedication. 10 years, Sarah marveled, standing beside Thomas as they surveyed the gathered crowd. It feels like both forever and no time at all. The best 10 years of my life, Thomas said, raising his glass in a toast. Here is to at least 50 more. To 50 more, Sarah echoed, clinking her glass against his. Around them, their children played with other children whose parents had moved to Murphy's specifically because of the school. The oak tree still stood outside, now surrounded by a small park that Thomas had built, complete with benches and a playground. The bell he had installed still rang every morning to call students to learning. As the evening grew late, and the stars appeared overhead, Thomas and Sarah slipped outside for a quiet moment alone. They walked to the oak tree where Sarah had first taught, where Thomas had first watched and decided to build something permanent. I think about that day sometimes, Sarah said, touching the rough bark of the ancient tree. Sitting here with my students, having no idea that a cowboy was watching and planning to change my life. I think about it too, Thomas admitted. How close I came to just riding through Murphy's like I had ridden through 100 other towns. What made me stop and watch? What made me decide to stay? Fate, Sarah suggested. Love, Thomas corrected. I did not know it then, but I was already falling in love with you. With your dedication, your courage, your refusal to accept that children should go uneducated just because a town could not be bothered to provide a building. Sarah turned to face him, her hands finding his in the darkness. You gave me so much more than a schoolhouse. You gave me partnership, family, a life richer than anything I dreamed of when I left Philadelphia. We gave each other that, Thomas said. That is what love is, I think. Not one person saving another, but two people building something together that neither could create alone. They kissed under the oak tree, just as a shooting star streaked across the Texas sky, a bright trail of light that seemed like the universe's blessing on their life and their love. Inside the schoolhouse, the party continued, voices and laughter spilling out into the warm night. But for a moment, Thomas and Sarah stood in the place where their story began, grateful for every choice that had led them to this moment, every challenge they had overcome, every joy they had shared. The schoolhouse bell chimed softly in the breeze, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The sounds of the frontier, wild and civilized at once, the perfect metaphor for the life they had built together. As they walked back toward the celebration, Thomas squeezed Sarah's hand. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For letting me build you a schoolhouse. For marrying me. For being my partner in all of this. For giving me a life worth living. Thank you for the same, Sarah replied. And for being the kind of man who sees what needs to be done and does it, even when no one asks, even when it is hard. They rejoined their family and friends, their children running to greet them with demands for stories and attention. Thomas scooped up Catherine while Sarah picked up David, and they stood together surrounded by the community they had helped create, the love they had built as surely as Thomas had built the schoolhouse walls. In the years that followed, Thomas and Sarah would face challenges and celebrations, sorrows and joys. They would bury parents and welcome grandchildren. They would see Murphy's grow from a rough frontier town into a proper city with paved streets and electric lights. They would watch their children grow into remarkable adults who would carry forward the values of education and hard work and building something meaningful. But the core of their life together remained the same. The foundation laid in 1873 when a determined teacher met a cowboy with a vision. Love built through action and commitment, through showing up every day and doing the work, through choosing each other over and over again. The schoolhouse stood for generations, eventually becoming a historical landmark that people visited to learn about frontier education. A plaque was installed near the entrance, telling the story of Sarah Northfield, who taught under an oak tree, and Thomas Nash, who built her a schoolhouse and built their love. On their 50th wedding anniversary, when Thomas was 76 and Sarah was 71, they returned to the oak tree with their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The schoolhouse still stood solid behind them, though it was now part of a much larger school complex. The bell Thomas had installed still rang, though it was now rung by a pull rope rather than by hand. Sarah's hair was white, and her hands were marked by age, but her eyes still sparkled with the same intelligence and determination that had drawn Thomas to her all those years ago. Thomas moved more slowly now, his joints stiff with decades of hard work, but his smile was the same, warm and genuine and full of love for the woman beside him. "Tell us the story, Grandma," begged 8-year-old Elizabeth, James's daughter. "Tell us about teaching under the tree." Sarah looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "It was a long time ago," Sarah began, her voice still strong despite her years. "In 1873, I came to Murphy's with nothing but books and determination. The town had no schoolhouse, but it had children who needed to learn, so I found this oak tree and began teaching right here under its branches." "And then Grandpa built the school," Elizabeth prompted, having heard the story many times but never tiring of it. "Then your grandpa built the school," Sarah confirmed, reaching for Thomas's hand. "He was a cowboy who had been drifting from place to place, but he decided to stay in Murphy's and build something permanent, something that would last." "The schoolhouse has lasted a very long time," observed 12-year-old Samuel, named for his grandfather. "My teacher says it is one of the oldest buildings in town." "That is because your great-grandfather built it right," Thomas said, pride evident in his voice. "Good materials, careful construction, attention to detail. When you build something, you should build it to last." "That is true for buildings," Sarah added, squeezing Thomas's hand. "And it is true for love. Your grandfather and I built our love the same way he built that schoolhouse. With care and attention and the determination to make something that would last." The family gathered around them. 3 generations descended from the teacher and the cowboy, each carrying forward pieces of their legacy. Some were educators, some were ranchers. Some had pursued entirely different paths, but all had been shaped by the example of Sarah and Thomas's partnership. As the sun set over Murphy's, casting golden light across the landscape that had been their home for more than 50 years, Thomas and Sarah sat together under the oak tree, surrounded by the family they had created and the community they had helped build. No regrets. Thomas asked softly, a question he had asked many times over the decades. "Not a single one," Sarah replied, the answer she had given every time. "You. Just that I did not find you sooner," Thomas said. "Think of all the additional years we could have had." "We have had plenty," Sarah said contentedly. "More than enough to build a beautiful life." They sat in comfortable silence as the family gradually dispersed, heading home for the evening. Finally, it was just the two of them under the oak tree where it had all begun. where a determined teacher and a purposeful cowboy had started building something that would outlast them both. The schoolhouse bell rang one last time as the sun disappeared below the horizon, a clear note of celebration and completion, the sound of a life well lived and a love well built. Thomas and Sarah Nash would both live several more years, continuing to be active in their community and devoted to their family. When they eventually passed, within months of each other in the way of couples who have been together so long they cannot imagine separate existence, the entire town of Murphys mourned. They were buried side by side in the cemetery overlooking the valley, their headstones simple but meaningful. Sarah and Thomas Nash, teacher and builder, partners in love and life. The schoolhouse remained standing, a monument to what two determined people could accomplish when they worked together. And under the oak tree where Sarah had first taught, where Thomas had first decided to build something permanent, where their love had taken root and flourished, new generations of children continued to learn and play and dream about their own futures, inspired by the story of the teacher who refused to give up and the cowboy who built her a schoolhouse and built their love.